I'm Dr. Bernard Starr. Today I'm going to present with some additional visuals and commentary an article that I published on August 5th, 2020 in Op-Ed News. My article poses a provocative challenge to those seeking the destruction of monuments of rebel Civil War figures and slave owners, currently a heated subject of debate. We can understand the gut urge to tear them down. They serve as celebrations of an ugly chapter in our history, and we certainly don't want to see these statues staring at us in our daily lives. But is destroying them the best solution? History has never looked kindly on demolishing, hiding, or erasing history. And our worship today of slave-produced monuments around the world, and there are lots of them, so many in fact, that they pose a disturbing logical dilemma, as my brief journey through history will reveal. One answer to this dilemma is my proposal with a graphic example at the end of the article that illustrates how to resolve this dilemma. Erect a statue with a compelling narrative inscribed, which I provide, alongside an objectionable statue. In my example, the slave and her horrific story of suffering will devastatingly shatter the offensive ideology of the historical figure next to her. At the same time, it will provide an authentic picture of slavery to counter the current sanitized versions. I hope you will stay with me till the end of the article so you can hear this slave story. Now to the article titled, "After Destroying Statues of Washington and Jefferson and Closing the Show Hamilton, Should We Burn the Bible?" If you wanted to expunge from history all offensive representations of slavery, you would have to begin with one of the oldest documents, first put into writing in the 6th century BCE. The Torah, the Old Testament, the foundation of monotheistic religions, is rife with rules for managing slaves. The Torah commands that, quote, "When you buy a Hebrew slave, he must be freed after 6 years of service," end quote, Exodus 21:2. That, quote, "When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years, as men slaves are," end quote, Exodus 21:7. That, quote, "When a master beats a slave who survives, there will be no avenging since the slave is his property," end quote, Exodus 21:20-21. There is also a warning not to be ruthless with kinsman slaves, Leviticus 25:39-46, and praise when a slave is freed. Quote, "The Lord and your God will bless you in all you do," end quote, Deuteronomy 15:18. There are other writings by revered authors that reject equality for all and embrace slavery. For example, Greek philosopher Aristotle, 384-322 BCE, is a towering figure whose teachings are considered the foundation of Western civilization. The discovery in the Middle Ages of his forgotten writings helped bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. He gave us the principles of logic and reasoning that contributed to the development of mathematics, the sciences, and virtually every other discipline. In guiding us toward the good life, he taught the golden mean, the avoidance of excesses for the fulfillment of the highest goal in life, the pursuit of happiness. For centuries, scholars have mourned that only 31 of 200 works of Aristotle have survived. But how do we reconcile his brilliant and inspiring teachings with the dark side of his philosophy? Aristotle not only endorsed slavery, he believed it was natural. In his book Politics, he wrote, "From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule." Just as the founding fathers of American democracy wrote that all men are created equal, but in practice meant some are more equal than others, Aristotle believed that the pursuit of happiness is not only unavailable to those born to be slaves, but that the slave class must devote their lives to serving the master class. We cannot change the wording in the Old Testament, Aristotle's embrace of slavery, or the fact that slavery existed in virtually every society throughout history? Does that mean we should send the Bible, all the works of Aristotle, and memories of every despotic culture to the trash heap? This question becomes more troubling when we look at slavery in other historical cultures. If the goal is to sanitize history, there is an extensive list of candidates for potential destruction. Destroying some of these objectionable monuments and other reminders of oppression will disappoint the untold numbers, even those who would take down statues of Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton, whose bucket lists of places to visit might be totally wiped clean. Let's start with the Great Wall of China, which began in 470 to 476 BCE. It took more than 7 dynasties, some 2,000 years, to complete the 13,170-mile wall. It was initially completed during the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE. Some sections were rebuilt and extended during the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1648. Over the centuries, different emperors used slaves and low-paid workers who were forced to toil like slaves. For example, Emperor Qin, quote, used peasants, captured enemies, criminals, scholars, and anyone else who irritated him. Laborers were not paid for their work. It was slave labor, end quote. And the treatment of the workers was abominable. Quote, rocks fell on people, walls caved in, workers died of exhaustion and disease, laborers were fed only enough food to keep them alive, end quote. More than 1 million workers are estimated to have died during the construction. A well-known Chinese saying captures their grim fate. Each stone in the wall represents a life lost in the wall's construction. 4,500 years ago, slaves and forced laborers built the Egyptian pyramids. The Torah, in the book of Exodus, tells the story of the more than 200 years when Jewish slaves were forced to work on the pyramids under the most unimaginable brutal conditions. Jews were not alone. Many other people suffered similar fates in constructing tributes to the pharaohs, who had little respect for the sanctity of life. Classical Greece and Imperial Rome launched massive projects across their empires, such as the Acropolis, Greek, and the Colosseum and Circus Maximus, Roman. The Greeks and the Romans were known for their brutal warfare. Their battles not only expanded their domains and power, they also fed their need for slaves to do domestic work, and more importantly, to construct imposing monuments. For example, after defeating the Scythians in 339 BCE, Alexander the Great's father, Philip II of Macedon, reportedly sold 20,000 women and children into slavery. And in one Roman victory in the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, a massive 75,000 slaves were acquired. The Greeks were undaunted by the inaccessible terrain where they built some of their monuments, locations modern builders wouldn't dare to touch. For example, the temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bacchae was located in the almost inaccessible rugged mountains of Arcadia at an altitude of 1,131 feet. The temple is one of the best preserved Greek monuments because of its remote locations. It was lost for more than 1,700 years until it was found again in the 18th century. For the Greeks and Romans, difficult construction only meant the need for more slaves. God-forsaken locations pose no obstacle if you have enough slaves whose lives you are willing to sacrifice. The use of slaves did not mean that construction still wasn't costly. Some paid skilled workers were usually required, and construction materials were expensive. Consider, too, that slaves had to be fed and housed, even if the living conditions were abominable and the food provided at starvation levels. Not surprisingly, the disease and death rates for slaves were high, particularly for those who worked in mines and construction sites. They were pushed to toil for at least 12 hours a day. The Romans deplored the Jewish practice of the Sabbath, a mandatory day of rest. They called it laziness. To build the massive Colosseum in Rome, Emperor Vespasian found a convenient source of labor and finance. The construction was almost entirely paid by gold and other treasures stolen from the temple in Jerusalem, which was demolished during the Roman-Jewish War in 66 to 74 CE. This fact was confirmed in 2001 by Professor Geza Alfoldi of Heidelberg University. He discovered an inscription in a stone plaque in the Colosseum dating to the 1st century. Another prize in the war for Emperor Vespasian was the 60,000 Jewish slaves who were dragged in chains to Rome to toil on the Colosseum. Most people in Greek and Roman societies benefited from spectacular architectural constructions, except, of course, the slaves. Ordinary citizens took pride in the achievements of their advanced civilizations. Slave traders financed wars to seize slaves for the projects, which earned them riches. Emperors basked in the conviction that their creations would award them immortality. For generals, there was glory, power, and material rewards for their military victories. The perks for the foot soldiers were the usual murder, pillaging, and rape. Let's now visit Hagia Sophia Church in Istanbul. Built by the Christian Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, it is also revered by Muslims. It became a mosque after the Turkish conquest in 1453. Since 1934, it has been a secular museum. But on July 10, 2020, the top court in Turkey annulled its museum status, and Turkey's President Erdogan promptly reverted Hagia Sophia to a mosque. Muslim praying at the site resumed on July 24th, despite protests from around the world. This huge masterpiece of Byzantine architecture was built by 10,000 workers, mostly slaves. For 1,000 years it was the largest enclosed human-made space on the planet. Hagia Sophia was completed in the record time of fewer than 6 years. With an unlimited supply of slaves, record time is standard. Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan commissioned the magnificent red brick covered with white marble Taj Mahal. Construction started in 1631 and was mostly completed in 17 years. The mausoleum was a tribute to Shah Jahan's favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, who died in childbirth with her 14th pregnancy. In 1983, UNESCO designated the Taj Mahal a World Heritage Site, calling it the jewel of Muslim art in India and one of the universally admired masterpieces of the world's heritage. The immensity of the Taj Mahal is indicated by the 1,000 elephants that were used to transport construction materials. Legend says that after construction was completed, Shah Jahan ordered the amputation of hands or thumbs of many of the craftsmen so that they would never be able to construct a monument as perfect as his wife's mausoleum. Nevertheless, working on the Taj Mahal was no picnic. Indian Minister Yogi Adityanath of Uttar Pradesh just recently said that the Taj Mahal, quote, was built on the backs of around 22,000 laborers who were basically slaves, end quote. And he added that the cost of 70 billion rupees, more than 1 billion in today's US dollars, quote, was collected from impoverished villages and shopkeepers in the form of oppressive taxation, end quote. Tourists today travel great distances to celebrate these wonders of civilization, largely founded on slavery. But who can be bothered by the pesky notion of deadly slave labor during a pleasant stroll along the walkways of the Great Wall, 10 million visitors each year, or while imbibing the fragrances in the magnificent gardens of the Taj Mahal, 7 to 8 million visitors each year? Does anyone mourn the sacrificed slaves while they breathlessly climb up to the temple of Apollo Epicurus in the mountains of Arcadia? More than 20 million tourists visit various Greek monuments each year. Or while beholding the awesome Giza pyramids, 9 million visitors each year. And the spiritually inspiring Hagia Sophia Church Mosque Museum, 3 million visitors each year. Does it occur to anyone wandering through the spectator stands, sprawling performance arena, and gladiator quarters of the Roman Colosseum that everything seen, touched, and walked on bears the handwork of abused Jewish slaves? Should we recommend tearing down these reminders of inhumanity, suffering, and death? If governments where the monuments reside object, should we ban travel to these wonders of the world? In proposing to destroy remembrances of your choice of tyrant and objects, you can't escape the extension of that logic to every country and culture throughout history, and today. You can't legitimately argue to destroy your marked choices without the others. But if that were to happen, the orgy of purification would lead to chaos and absurdity. And this question: would beating up on the past advance or ensure justice and equality for us today and into the future? History has never looked kindly on the destruction of cultures and cultural artifacts, even if they were creations of despised leaders and unjust societies. More than 3,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians tried to erase the existence of Pharaoh Akhenaten and his wife, Queen Nefertiti. They were successful until archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered in the desert of North Africa busts of them and other artifacts from the time they ruled. We learned that Akhenaten rejected the plethora of Egyptian gods and introduced the first known instance of monotheism. After deposing of him and restoring the traditional gods, subsequent rulers strived to erase all memories of Akhenaten. Statues of him were destroyed, and his name was removed from all written records. Historians mourn that we still have only sketchy knowledge about this fascinating lost period of history. In Florence, Italy, at the dawn of the Renaissance, the end of the 15th century, fundamentalist priest Girolamo Savonarola cast a spell over the populace of the city. Savonarola declared war on culture, artistic creations, and any object that reflected pride and vanity. His rabid followers cheered as Savonarola's bonfire of the vanities turned magnificent masterpieces into ashes for the greater glory of God. Eventually, the citizens of Florence and Catholic Church officials tired of his excesses and disposed of Savonarola, sending his body up in flames, and restored the enlightened ideals of the Renaissance. Savonarola's ugly chapter of terror teaches us that to pave a path toward enlightenment, you must defeat current tyrants, not dead ones. Yes, we shouldn't have to stare at statues of despots and abusers in our main squares, workplaces, thoroughfares, and malls. Most of the tributes to bondage should be removed, but not destroyed. Place them in warehouses and museums where scholars and spectators can gain insights into human nature and the expression of values throughout history from studying them. Philosopher George Santayana got it right when he warned, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." In retaining some representative objectionable monuments, we could deflate them and their oppressive ideologies by constructing monuments alongside them with a different message, such as this story, a montage created from slave narratives. My name is Mustafa. My slave master called me Mary. When I was 17 years old, I was kidnapped from my tribe in Africa. I was dragged in chains to the bottom of a big ship. The kidnappers called themselves Portuguese. There were many other slaves crushed together on the ship. We were given very little food or water during the long voyage. The floor was always wet or flooded, and the air stank. Many became sick and died. They were thrown into the sea. When we arrived in the New World, I was forced to stand almost naked in a marketplace where slave owners looked at me and touched me. I was terrified, lonely, and cried without stop. I was sold to a plantation owner. Over the years, my master and his 3 sons raped me. I gave birth to 3 children whom I loved, even though they were produced by sin. They were the only things that were mine. But when they were grown, they were ripped from me and sold to other plantations. I never saw them again. I once found a small book that had been thrown away and tried to learn how to read. A spy reported me. The master took away my book. He said it was a bad example for other slaves and threatened to punish me severely if I was ever found with the book again. I once tried to escape, but the bloodhounds caught me. I was whipped so badly that I was a cripple for the rest of my life. And the man next to me, sitting high on his horse, devoted his life to keeping me a slave. To remember the past, we have to preserve the past. Learn from history. Don't hide, destroy, or erase history. The more we look into every nook and cranny of history, the more regrettable flaws, some horrific, will we find. So do we discard everything, or do we take what's good and move forward? Perhaps the best answer to that question is a comment from Mahatma Gandhi when he was famously asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" His answer, "I think it would be a good idea," which implies they ought to try it. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Bernard Starr. I'll be back with more soon.